Hi everyone, it's Miss Reed, and for homework tonight, I want you to watch this video about introduction paragraphs. I'm going to be giving you some notes on how to structure your introductions when you're writing about literature. Take some time to watch the video, but I think it's also a really good idea to sit down and take these notes as you're watching. Studies have shown that when you actively take notes, you have a tendency to better retain the material. And you'll have a nice little reference point. You'll always have this video to reference, but sometimes it's also great to have those actual typewritten notes. So take some time, feel free to pause, feel free to go back, and then we're going to be ready to start practicing introduction writing in class tomorrow. So when we write introductions, I want you to think about it in this visual way. An introduction is like a funnel. You're going to start off very, very broad, and as you progress through, it's going to get more and more narrow. So we start off with a hook, which is going to be a broad general statement, all the way down to a thesis, which is a really specific argument with justification for why that argument is true. So if you can kind of get this visual in mind, you can think about idea-wise the way that you want to structure. So let's take a look at each of the components so that we feel comfortable with writing an introduction. First and foremost, we typically start off an introduction with what I like to call a hook. You might have heard grabber or attention getter before, but hook is the terminology that I typically like to use. So a hook is going to usually be 1 to 2 sentences, and what a hook actually does is it introduces the general topic of the essay. So you guys can kind of type that into your notes, that a hook introduces the general topic of an essay. When we think about the hook, I think the purpose is what usually sticks in most people's mind. The purpose in some way is to get the reader's attention, and it also sets up the big idea of the essay. The second part is actually the more important part, the setting up the big idea of the essay. The hook introduces that general topic, and so therefore that's what we really have to think about. A lot of people, when they get into their head that it gets the reader's attention, they start to think of all of these kind of big, bold ideas that might not necessarily be the best way to start. When you're younger, you use a lot of different techniques to learn about how to do hooks, but we definitely want to avoid a couple of steps. So for the do's and don'ts, do make an interesting statement about your topic. And make sure that it connects to what you're eventually going to argue. Some don'ts. Now, some of these you're going to say, but hey, I learned about that in middle school, and that's okay. In middle school, you guys learn a lot of what's called scaffolding. Scaffolding is information that kind of helps you learn how to build your paragraphs. But if you think about when we use scaffolding on a building, if a builder's building a building, they need the scaffolding to kind of help keep things upright while building. But what happens is that after the building is created, we remove the scaffolding because the scaffolding is kind of ugly and unsightly. So some types of hooks that we want to avoid in high school are going to be quotations. So you don't want to use a quotation. You don't want to use a question. I always hear, like, have you ever wondered what it was like to be an astronaut? Some sort of variation on that. While those are a great way to kind of learn how to think about introducing a topic, it is a little bit too young for a high school, especially an honors level class. So you want to kind of avoid those questions. You also want to avoid talking directly about the text. Remember that we start off in the introduction funnel super broad, so we don't quite yet want to be able to talk about the text. That comes in the next part, which is the tag and context. So the tag and context is going to be 3 to 5 sentences. And in those 3 to 5 sentences, you have a couple of jobs. First and foremost, the tag is an acronym and it stands for the title, author, and genre. So for the tag, you're going to introduce the text, title, author, and genre. Now, when I say genre, I mean what type of literature it is. Short story, poem, novel, essay. I don't actually mean mystery or realistic fiction. This is kind of the baseline of telling your reader what type of literature you're going to be exploring. A short story is very different from a novel. Even though both of them tell stories, they use really different techniques. So that's a good thing to clarify. And you always want to introduce the text and the author because that's the main focus of what you're going to be trying to be talking about. The background information is the context. So context here, what is it? It's background for the text. However, you want to make sure that that background is focused in on the point that you're going to be making. There's no need to set background for elements of the story that are completely unrelated to what you're actually writing an essay about. So if you were writing about Romeo's impulsiveness in Romeo and Juliet, you wouldn't want to have a whole section talking about Juliet's relationship with her nurse, because we're not writing about that, so we don't need to provide background information for that, even though it's part of the overall play of Romeo and Juliet. So think about your context setting up your thesis. Look back to that image. We go from broad and we get narrower. So we have this big topic, then we're getting into the book and how that big topic is being presented in the book. So that's the kind of background you want to be giving. So what's that purpose of the tag? The tag's purpose is basically to set up the text for your reader. And the context sets up background information connected to the big idea. So you want to start getting specific into your story, introduce any important characters or storylines that have to do with the point that you're making. Last but not least, we have our most important part of our entire essay. The thesis statement is the backbone of what you're going to be doing. And so the thesis is a bold argument and its justification. So we want to make an argument about the text, and we want to also include the reason why our argument is true. Now, notice if you go back to the introduction funnel, the thesis is the most narrow. A lot of kids get really nervous with writing specific theses. I kind of always hear all the time, if I write a specific thesis, then what am I supposed to write about in the essay? Well, you have to change your mindset. You want your thesis to be super, super specific. And then what the rest of the essay does is the rest of the essay proves how that's true using textual evidence and your analysis of the textual evidence. You're going to have tons of stuff to write about because you are bringing in that evidence. You're explaining how that evidence helps to go back and prove that thesis statement. So I really want you guys to think about you need to get as specific as possible. Imagine if all you had was one sentence to try to get your point across. That's how you have to treat your thesis statement. So basically, if we think about thesis statement purpose, we have to think about this as the backbone of our paper that guides our reader to what we're trying to argue. We want it to be nice and clear to our reader what we're arguing so they can kind of follow our logic as we progress on through. So there are actually two types of thesis statements, and this can become important when we're talking about how to write for English versus how to write for history. An open thesis basically argues one main point. A closed thesis is what I like to call the 3-point thesis. And a 3-point thesis makes an argument and gives 3 reasons why it's true. Now, both of these thesis statement types are totally fine and they have appropriate uses. But in English, we want to argue the one main point with justification. So I'm going to kind of make a note here, used for English essays. A closed thesis is mostly going to be used for history essays. Basically, in a closed thesis statement, you're outlining what your 3 body paragraphs are going to be about. So this is true because this, and this. Like I said, this is a valid thesis type, especially for history writing, but we're going to kind of probably want to avoid it when we're talking about English. Instead, when we think about English, our body paragraphs are going to be reasons why our one main point is true. So we're going to kind of be really exploring the text and how the text helps to prove the thesis. The open thesis is really beneficial for when you want to show strong critical analysis. The closed thesis is really great for bringing in tons of historical facts. So we, especially in an honors class, are going to try to avoid closed thesis statements at all costs. We're going to really be practicing how to write an open thesis. So our do is do use an open thesis, and our don't is don't use a closed thesis. This is just a basic outline for you. I've also included on OneNote a model paragraph, and I would like you guys to take a look at that model paragraph after you watch this video. The model paragraph will show what this looks like in action. So there's going to be a hook, a tag in context, and a thesis statement. So check that out. And remember, write down any questions that you might have. I obviously, by recording this video, can't answer questions as they come up, but that's how we're going to open class before we begin to practice. So hopefully you found these notes helpful. I hope you took some notes as you were watching, and be ready to take a look tomorrow. Take a look at the model that's posted on OneNote, and also take a look at the rubric. There's a specific rubric that I have for introduction paragraphs, and you'll see it's broken down by hook, tag and context, thesis statement, and then also your grammar, mechanics, and format. So look at all these materials, come in ready to practice tomorrow, and I'll be able to answer any questions you may have. Thanks, guys.